Being a body snatcher is not what it was. My family used to follow this trade, and a couple of 100 years ago, there was a good living to be made from the dead. The illegally exhumed bodies of the freshly buried could be sold to be used in the teaching of anatomy. There was profit in this thriving trade. Now, all people want are body parts, kidneys, eyes, hearts, and the like, for use in transplants. There's no demand for the whole thing. Obviously, I have no plans to become a body snatcher. I'm going to college to study graphic design. Before then, I've been going through a bunch of old boxes handed down through my family over the years. There was a journal in one which caught my attention. It was the winter of 1825 when the journal begins. The cold has been merciless. These last days, the freezing wind has cut through me, while I have gone about my business and left me shaking and miserable. Being at the inn was helping, and I really did not want to leave. The ale was strong, and the serving maid was unmarried and had a few teeth left. A night in her arms would put the fire back in my bones, but I had work to do. I sighed, downed the last of my ale, and left a coin on the table to settle my bill. Darkness lay like a shroud over the town as I trudged miserably away. Holes swimming with rainwater and dung waited like traps, and a half-dozen times my boots were dunked in the fetid mud. I pulled my cloak tighter about me and continued out of town. It was mercifully quiet. Only the sound of my ragged breath disturbed the peace. I lit my pipe. Apart from its weak glow, there were no lights, until I saw a lantern swinging some way off, and the silhouette revealed by it. I could not be sure if this was a friend or foe, and I clasped the handle of my knife held in my waistband beneath my cloak. As I came closer, the shadow formed a face. Mercy Smith was not a pleasant sight. A fat scar ran down one cheek. His eyebrows had been singed off when he had fallen drunkenly into a fire and had never grown back. The only other hair in his head sprouted thickly from his ears and his nostrils. Mercy was woefully misnamed. He was quick to anger and bore grudges over the pettiest of things. He stank as well, worse than anything that flowed from a horse's backside. And he was my partner. Mercy had won the wooden teeth he wore from another man in a card game, and he had to take them out to speak, which he did to mutter, "Joseph," by way of a greeting to me. In return, I'd asked, "Are you ready for our labors?" He nodded and put his teeth back in. I told Mercy to extinguish the lamp. We did not want to be seen. He did so, and without another word, we went on our way. The graveyard was seated on a steep hill. It rose up before us in the darkness, and we blew out our cheeks and cussed as we scrambled up to the top. The oldest graves were the first that we left in our wake. The grave diggers and the men of the cloth had started laying the dearly departed to rest around the base of the hill. As time had passed and the earth had been too crowded to squeeze any more in, the graves had been dug higher and higher, until now the summit was all that was left. Here were the fresh graves, mounds of earth patted down but not settled, headstones with their inscriptions carved days since. I took a long draw on my pipe and pointed at one. "That looks newest," I said. Mercy grunted and knelt down and began to dig. He used his bare hands and looked more like a beast than the pinnacle of creation as he labored. The soil cleared and the coffin exposed. He took the metal bar that he wore around his neck as if it were a charm and began to crack open the lid. It protested but soon gave, and Mercy pulled away the lid. A woman's body lay within. She looked to be around 1 in years and to have been buried for only a few hours. If she had been left there, her long blonde hair would have continued to grow, while her skin decayed. Her nails would have lengthened, while their flesh was eaten by the insects once they had burrowed through the coffin. She'll bring a fair price, I said. Mercy lifted the body. I took the arms and together we returned her to the surface of the world. In the partnership between Mercy and myself, he was the brute labor and I the brains. And now we had the goods, I would negotiate the price. First, we needed to get her to the corpse man. He plied his trade from a mansion that he had constructed deep within the woods. The entrance to the road which led to the mansion was hidden between the densely growing trees. The man in the know, and I was such one, carried the secret of this location. With the body held in the sack thrown over his shoulder, Mercy followed me and we made our way along the road. Armed men stationed in the undergrowth watched our progress. We were known to them, or else we would have been corpses ourselves long before we made it to the mansion. Night still held us in its dark embrace and no lights marked out the mansion. I knew only from experience that we were coming close, when I heard a voice call out, "What do you bring?" "One," I replied, fresh and whole with no signs of disease. "Approach," the voice told me. We stepped lively forwards until we were close enough to see the man who had spoken. The watchman's eyes were hollow sockets. He had followed our progress by the sound of the fallen leaves beneath our feet. I think only a ghost or some other being without substance could have snuck up on him. I placed a coin in his outstretched hand and he said, "Enter." A heavy door stood before us. I heaved it open and moved aside to let Mercy and his burden through. Lamps hung on the walls showed the way and we hurried on until the passage opened into a vast room. Dozens of corpses were laid out on tables. Their burial clothes had been removed and were neatly folded into piles placed around the floor. There was one pile for shoes, one for shirts, another for trousers, another yet for dresses. The corpse man would sell these through one of his intermediaries in inns across the county. It was all part of the process of harvesting the dead. He himself stood over one of the bodies and was noting down some detail in the ledger that he held. He did not look up when he said, "Put her on that table there." Mercy laid down the body and I stepped up to the corpse man and we began our discussion. I couldn't push too hard because he held all the cards, but we agreed on 3 guineas. An honest man could not earn that in 6 months of backbreaking work. As Mercy and I were taking our leave, we saw a coach and horses pull up outside the mansion, and 2 large boxes being carried out and placed inside it. It was 2 more bodies I knew, setting off on their journey to Newcastle or York or Edinburgh to supply an anatomist with a specimen on which the science of dissection could be taught. From his mansion, the corpse man fulfilled the needs of learned men throughout the land. Mercy and I were content to play our part and we set off to find an inn to raise a cup to our latest sale. "To the maiden," I said a little while later as we sat by a roaring fire. Mercy's teeth lay on the table. He was already on his 3rd ale and I decided to put them in my pocket. He was bizarrely fond of his wooden teeth but had a habit of losing them when he got drunk. The rest of the day passed pleasantly and we were merry by the time that dusk came. Looking back, we should have found beds for the night, but because of our high spirits we decided to try and add to our wealth. We did not want a chance returning to the scene of last night's misdeeds. Our trade was not illegal. The law stated that a dead body was not owned by anyone. If we had stolen a horse or a loaf, then the law would be on us, as these things belonged to someone. But we could not be prosecuted for taking a corpse that belonged to no one in the eyes of the law. The worst that we could be tried for was the theft of the clothes that the body was buried in. However, the good people of the land looked sourly on the act of body snatching, and a number of our fellows had been set on by mobs and beaten most viciously. So we needed to be careful, and set off walking to a neighboring village where we had not been for more than half a year. It was deep into the night when we had arrived, and apart from a 3/4 moon, all was dark. It was a small gathering of dwellings. All were shuttered and it seemed all those within were asleep. and nestled on one edge of the village stood a small church and a graveyard. At my side, Mercy grinned. I had returned his teeth to him and we had laughed at the end. "If we find a good corpse in here," I whispered to him, "I'll have a new set of teeth made for you, carved to fit and smooth to shine." He nodded enthusiastically and led the way. The graves were laid out in rows, and at the end of one we found what we were looking for. A new headstone stood out in the moonlight. It was large and flamboyant. Whoever was buried in this grave must have been very wealthy. Hoping there would be a bonus to be made from finding a corpse draped in fine cloth, we set to work. A layer of loose soil still lay over the fresh grave. Mercy crouched down and, using his hands, began to sweep it away. It all happened so quickly then. The sound that filled the night, Mercy falling backwards, the harsh scent of gunpowder, the blood cascading from the bullet wound in Mercy's forehead. I fell on my knees, tried to stem the flow with my hands, but it was no use. Mercy's eyes stared back at me blindly. My partner was dead. I turned to look at the gun which had been hidden in the soil. A taut cord had been set to pull the trigger if the soil was disturbed. I had heard rumors of such things, of grave guns, left as traps for body snatchers by the relatives of the newly buried. I thought this was just gossip, but now I knew that they were a fact, a cold hard truth. I closed Mercy's eyelids and wept. It was almost dawn before I left the graveyard. I was in a daze and I walked for hours, and I had no plan, no destination in mind. I found myself in an area that I did not recognize. The open countryside through which I had been drifting had brought me to a small town. I decided to find an inn and keep drinking until I passed out. I walked along a street lined with grand houses, and at the end of the street there is a graveyard. I cursed. It was as if the world itself was taunting me. The graveyard was not like the other burial places that I had seen. They had all been open swaths of land decorated with resting places. High stone walls rose around the boundaries of this graveyard, and an intricate iron gate marked the entrance. There was a bill poster fixed to the gate. It proclaimed that this graveyard was the safest in the county, and that the owner had employed the latest measures to protect all buried there from those scoundrels who steal bodies. I thought of the grave gun that had killed Mercy and almost tore the poster down, but I held my temper and read further down on it that guards patrolled the graveyard during the night hours. An idea flashed through my mind. Now I was on my own. I needed new ways to procure corpses to sell, and it was better placed to steal the dead than the man employed to protect the dead. Feeling a little more like my old self, I went to find the owner of the graveyard and offer my services as a sober and law-abiding citizen who would make an upstanding guard. I found the owner in the graveyard supervising the unloading of a number of wooden barrels from a cart. I assumed it was the owner, from his tall and expensive frock coat, and the confidence with which he was issuing orders to the men and doing the actual work. I was proved right. I introduced myself as Thomas Miller, a former soldier recently returned home looking for an honest wage for an honest day's work. The lies dripped from my mouth with ease. The owner looked me up and down and said gruffly, "It's been hard to find men willing to spend the nights keeping watch over the graves, so you'll do, for now." I gave him a little salute and told him that I would not disappoint. The last of the barrels had now been unloaded and the laborers were putting on odd-looking garments. They were made of very sturdy-looking material and were all of one piece. Oddest of all was the helmets that the laborers helped each other fix in place. They were made of metal and spherical in shape. A piece of glass was fixed in front for the wearer to see through. The owner noticed that I had been staring at the men as they struggled into the outfits and said, "These garments were designed so that a human being could submerge under the waves and not drown. I purchased them to keep these men safe here in my graveyard." As he spoke, the man began to take the lids off the barrels and, using their gloved hands, scoop up a powdery substance that I saw was held inside. They carried this over to a grave and scattered the powder over it, and then they moved on to another grave and once again covered it with the powder. I was fascinated but mystified, and my expression must have once again given me away because the owner chuckled in a self-satisfied way and continued. I'm not only using guards and grave guns when the delivery of them arrives, but I am also empowering some very special measures of my own devising. The body you see being distributed was created for me by one of the county's most daring scientists, a truly brilliant individual who embraced my idea. The powder reacts with everything it is scattered over and transforms it into a new form of matter. The dirt of the grave, the wood of the coffin, the very flesh of the deceased, all can be changed. And once they are, their touch is deadly. A body snatcher who tries to lay hands on the corpses in my care will die in agony. His chest was visibly swollen by the time he had finished speaking. I was lost for words, and at first disheartened, but by the time the oddly dressed laborer had finished scattering the powder far and wide, and I had been given a lantern and a gun and told that I'd be paid in the morning, my determination had returned. The owner gave me his address, told me to report there for my coin, and then strode off, leaving me alone. I began pacing up and down the graveyard as darkness fell, not because I was making an effort to patrol, but because it helped me think. The powder was a problem. I did not know if it did what the owner claimed and didn't want to find out by touching anything with my bare skin. What I needed, I decided, was an outfit like the laborers had worn, and a couple of sturdy men to help me. I decided to go around the local inns in the morning and find what I required. In the meantime, I would locate the graves that I would rob when I was ready. I would not only do this 1 or 2 times either, but as many as I could. I would strike large and then make my escape. I was smiling as I made my way in between the graves. I could make my fortune here, I thought, and retire to my own grand house. The graveyard was a lonely place but full of promise. There were at least 5 bodies there that I could make a handsome profit from, and hopefully even more would be buried the next day. I reached the end of a row of graves and turned to retrace my steps, but the smile fell from my face. One of the graves had been violated. Soil lay scattered around a freshly appeared hole. I hurried forwards to the edge. The coffin lid had been thrown aside and the body had been gone. But how, I thought. There had been no one else in the graveyard. No one could have taken the body. I was scratching my head with the barrel of the gun and wondering what to do, when I saw a trail of pale liquid leading away from the disturbed grave. I leant over to put my finger in it. The liquid was sticky and did not need to bring it very close to my face to recoil at the sickly sweet smell of it. It was a smell that I knew all too well. Once a body decays to the point where it breaks down and produces fluid such as this, it is of no worth to the body snatcher, as no one will want to purchase it. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. Whoever had stolen this body had wasted their time, but still I could not let them get away with it. I needed to bring them to justice so I could keep my job for at least one more night. I set off in pursuit, letting the trail of bodily fluid show me the way. The body snatcher must have dragged the body away, I deduced, and my reasoning seemed confirmed as the trail led me in the direction of the gate. "I have you," I muttered under my breath. The owner had locked the gate when he left, and I was the only other person with a set of keys. Sure enough, there was the culprit, standing with their hands on the gate, rattling it in a vain attempt to open it. I could not see the exhumed body. Perhaps they had tucked it away and out of sight, while they tried to find a way out, I thought. I strode forwards, the gun raised, ready to fire if they resisted. "Hey, you there, thief," I called out. "Surrender." The scoundrel clearly heard me because they swung around. I began to shiver, not with the cold of that winter night, but because of this sight that now stood before me. It had been a man once, but now it was a monster. Its skin had rotted away and the flesh beneath was reduced in places to gristle that hung off exposed bone. Its eyes were cavities. The fluid which I had followed glistened over every part of it, and new trails hung between its fingers and the metal where it had grasped the gate. Trails that stretched out and broke as the monster moved away from the gate and started to shuffle towards me. I was held paralyzed for a moment by fear and then managed to stumble backwards and turned, ready to flee this hideous being. Only there was no path of escape. A dozen more graves had opened and disgorged the dead souls which had been buried there. They stood, swaying slightly from side to side. Once men, once women, some still wearing their burial garments over their bloated and darkened skin, others without any. These abominations wore no skin, no flesh, and no muscle. Time and nature had stripped them down to the bone. But how could this be? My mind raced to understand, and I could only see one reason. The dang powder that had been applied so liberally. It had raised the dead from their graves, and now the monsters were all descending on me. They were coming closer and closer. One that still had stuff on its face and a tongue in its mouth whispered, "Poison, you poisoned us. You have destroyed our resting place." Another added, "No," I said. "It was not me, it was the owner. He did this." The monsters turned to each other, muttered words too quiet for me to hear, and then one of them looked at me and said, "Take us to him." I did not need asking again. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 attempts to get the keys in the lock, but eventually, I swung the gate open and then hurried towards the owner's house. Behind me, I could hear the monsters' unsteady progress in their voices. These were creatures that it seemed, that chattered ceaselessly now they had returned from the grave. The address the owner had given me was one of the grand houses that I had passed by earlier. As I reached it, I saw a light in one of the windows, and moving closer, that he was still awake and sitting in an armchair. He was wearing a brightly colored silk dressing gown and smoking a cigar. He hadn't noticed me, or the monsters as they brushed past me. I moved aside, my skin crawling at their touch. They continued to the window pane and pressed their grotesque faces against the glass and cried out, You destroyed our resting place. You poisoned us." Over them, I could see first the look of shock on his face, and then the horror which possessed him as the monsters began to strike the glass, harder and harder until it shattered. And then the monsters moved inside and fell on him. They clawed at his face, bit his flailing arms, and then began to tear out chunks of him. I could not watch, and I turned away. After a few moments, the head of monsters' chattering voices coming closer and looked back to see them, emerging back out onto the street. One had the silk dressing gown draped over its shoulders. Another held the cigar. It still glowed, and the monster put it in its mouth and inhaled. And I watched in disgust as smoke drifted from the gaping wounds lining its throat. I swallowed down the bile which had risen in my mouth and said, "I've done what you've asked. Now let me go. I've caused you no harm." Once more the creatures conferred, their voices mingling, until one said to me, "We need the earth. We need to rest, and you will help us." I had no choice, it seemed. "Follow me," I said, and led them out of town and into the open countryside. I found a spot away from the track and fell onto my hands and knees and began to dig, as Mercy had once done with my hands. Desperation gave me strength that I had never possessed before, and I opened up a pit, and then dragged myself to my feet and stood back. "It is the best that I can do," I said. The monsters shuffled forward, into the grave that I had made for them. They shifted this way and that, but eventually lay still, and I started to cover them with soil. As I kicked the dirt over them with my boots, they continued to speak. I caught only fragments. They spoke about being torn from their dreamless rest. They talked about the anger they felt, and about the feel of the night air on their bones and how it hurt. How they wanted to know nothing again, and how all they wanted was to be at peace. My labors finished and the pit fully covered, I was ready to walk away. I had survived, and for now that was enough. The first traces of light were appearing in the sky, and the birds were beginning to stir. It was a dawn chorus that still haunts my dreams, one filled with birdsong and the waning chatter of the risen dead now settling back into their eternal sleep.